Sit down a minute. Let me tell you something you won't find printed in most history books. Something the old folks up in Harlem used to whisper about on the stoops when the streetlights came on. Something passed down like a family recipe, quiet, careful, only shared with somebody they trusted. This is a piece of Harlem oral tradition about the 1943 conflict between Bumpy Johnson and organized crime, and about a role that community memory says women played in it, a role most official accounts never mention at all. I want to be upfront with you before we go any further. Nobody can prove every detail of what you're about to hear. There's no file cabinet somewhere with documents confirming it. What there is decades of Harlem residents telling this story to their children and grandchildren, careful and low, the way people tell you something they believe matters, even when they can't point to a paper trail. Whether it happened exactly this way or not, it's been part of the neighborhood's memory for a long time, and I think that alone is worth listening to. Now, you have to understand what Harlem was in 1943. The war overseas was pulling young men away, shipping them off to places nobody in Harlem had ever heard of. And back home, the numbers game was still running strong, because folks needed something to hope for even in hard times. A quarter here, a quarter there, dreaming on 3 digits, dreaming of getting lucky just once. And Bumpy Johnson was one of Harlem's most influential underworld figures at the time, a man who ran a large piece of that numbers operation and who, by most accounts, was seen by many in the community as someone who kept outside criminals from treating the neighborhood as territory to be drained for profit. That's not sanitizing history by making him into a hero. He was a criminal, by any legal definition, and he made his money the same way plenty of underworld figures did. But the documented history does show a man who understood Harlem as more than a business opportunity, and that understanding, storytellers say, shaped everything that came next. The broader conflict between Bumpy and the Italian-American crime families is well documented. Historians agree there were disputes over control of Harlem's gambling and numbers operations, along with periods of violent confrontation between Bumpy's people and the downtown families. Beyond that broad outline, however, the historical record becomes much less complete, and that's where Harlem oral tradition begins to fill in the gaps. Some storytellers say that after Bumpy embarrassed the downtown families in that first encounter, the smart move would have been for them to walk away and cut their losses. But pride is a powerful thing, and men in that position rarely built their reputations by quietly backing down. So according to the version of events passed down in Harlem, they came back, quieter, more careful. And that, the story goes, is when Bumpy had to think differently, because the same trick rarely works twice against a serious opponent. Here's the part of the story I find most interesting, and I want you to sit with it for a minute, because it's the heart of everything that follows. Community memory holds that the Italian crime families of that era carried a blind spot with them everywhere they went, a blind spot about women. In their world, according to how the story gets told, women were kept at a careful distance from the actual business of violence. Wives who didn't ask questions, mistresses who weren't told what their men did for a living, sisters who prayed in church pews and were never involved in what happened outside those walls. Whether this was universally true of every man in that world I can't say for certain, but the stereotype was real enough, and real enough that Harlem storytellers say Bumpy noticed it the way a card player notices another man's tell. And according to this piece of oral tradition, he decided to make that blind spot cost his enemies dearly. I want to be careful here, because this next part is where the story shifts almost entirely from documented history into community legend, and I think it deserves to be treated that way from here forward, not smoothed over into something more certain than it actually is. According to the version of events passed down through several Harlem families, this strategy didn't appear overnight. It grew slowly. One version of the story centers on a woman some called Odessa, though even the storytellers who share this account admit that the name may not be her real one, just a name used so nobody could ever trace anything back to her. The story says Odessa had grown up hunting in the rural South before her family came north during the Great Migration, and that she could shoot with real skill, a skill most people wouldn't have expected from a quiet neighborhood seamstress. Whether a woman by that description existed exactly as described, I can't confirm, but the story has been told this way for a long time, and it's worth hearing the way it's been passed down. The oral tradition holds that Bumpy first heard about a woman with this kind of skill through a young runner who mentioned it almost as an aside, and that Bumpy, rather than dismissing it, decided to see for himself. According to the story, he arranged an informal test in a quiet spot away from the street, and what he saw convinced him this was a resource worth taking seriously. From there, the story says, word spread carefully through trusted circles, the way sensitive information tends to move in a tight community. A hairdresser who'd once competed in shooting contests before she ever picked up a curling iron, a laundress whose late husband had taught her to hunt because he wanted a partner rather than just a wife, a young woman who worked at a factory during the week and spent Sunday afternoons at a private range where black residents could practice without interference. None of these women, according to the story, saw themselves as criminals or gangsters. They had jobs, families, and church on Sunday. What the story says Bumpy offered them was a chance to protect a community they already cared about deeply, using a skill nobody expected them to have. Storytellers say these women were never called soldiers. Nothing about this was ever written down, if it could be avoided, given the obvious risks involved. Some who've passed the story along use the term the Watchers, and there's often a note of quiet amusement in how it's said, because there was something almost sly about it, hiding real danger behind such an ordinary, domestic-sounding name. According to tradition, the Italian crews sent up to Harlem were looking for the kind of threat they understood and expected: armed men in a visible crew. They were not looking twice at a woman hanging laundry on a rooftop line, or a woman walking home from a factory shift carrying a long case that could have held almost anything. According to this oral history, the first real test of the idea came that spring, not long after the initial confrontation, when a small scouting crew was sent back up to Harlem, this time more quietly, meant to gather information rather than strike directly. The story says word of their presence traveled through the neighborhood before they'd gotten very far, the way news always seemed to move faster on Harlem streets than downtown crews expected. Several later encounters, according to the tradition, ended the same way. Unexplained warning shots fired from a distance convinced visiting crews it was safer to leave than to press forward. Nobody in these stories claims a clean, documented body count. What gets passed down instead is a general pattern: repeated attempts by outside crews to move through Harlem in force, and repeated, mysterious setbacks that none of them could ever quite explain or trace back to a specific shooter. One version of the story, often told in more detail than the others, describes a night later that summer when a larger crew attempted a direct assault on one of Bumpy's operations. According to this telling, several people were positioned at different points around the building, watching from angles nobody below could have anticipated, and the encounter ended badly for the visiting crew, with survivors unable to say clearly who or what had stopped them. I won't walk you through every detail of that account, partly because I think the details matter less than the pattern they represent, and partly because dwelling too long on any one violent encounter risks losing the real point of the story, which was never really about the shooting itself. The real point, as the storytellers tell it, was the fear that grew out of not understanding what you were up against. Losing a fight to a rival crew of known gangsters would have fit inside everything the Italian families believed about how this kind of conflict worked. But according to the tradition, losing repeatedly to something they couldn't identify, something that might have been standing beside them on an ordinary Harlem sidewalk without their ever knowing it, cut into their confidence in a different, deeper way. It's said that some of the more experienced men sent to investigate what was happening spent days in the neighborhood trying to build a picture of Bumpy's operation, watching known enforcers, following leads that never quite led anywhere, because they were looking for men, and the people they needed to be watching were flower sellers and choir members and seamstresses they'd walked past without a second thought. I think this is the part of the story that matters most, more than any individual encounter. What the tradition describes isn't really a story about violence, even though violence is part of it. It's a story about being underestimated, and about what happens when the people doing the underestimating never once stop to question their own assumptions. The Italian crime families of that era, as this story is told, had built their whole sense of danger and power around a very narrow idea of where threats could come from. And Harlem, according to the storytellers, understood something they didn't: that a community can hold resources and strengths that remain completely invisible to anyone looking at it from the outside. with an outsider's assumptions. I also want to say something about what this story suggests about the women themselves, because that part deserves attention too. According to tradition, these were not women looking for a life defined by danger. They had jobs they went to every morning, families depending on them, church pews they sat in every Sunday. What the story says drew them into this at all wasn't a taste for violence, but a wish to protect something they already loved: their own streets, their own neighbors, their own community's ability to keep what little economic power it had, rather than watching it drained away by outside interests. If the story is true even in broad outline, these women took on serious risk quietly and were never publicly acknowledged for it, which the storytellers say was exactly how they wanted it. According to the oral tradition, by later that summer, a pattern had become clear enough that even the most determined figures downtown had to take notice. Repeated setbacks, several of them unexplained, are said to have discouraged further direct attempts to take Harlem's territory by force. I want to be careful not to overstate this. There is no documented record I'm aware of confirming that the leadership of organized crime made any formal decision due to this specific pattern. What the tradition claims, more modestly, is that direct assaults on Harlem grew less frequent as time went on, and that community memory credits at least part of that shift to defenders nobody downtown ever properly identified. Historians who study this period generally agree that the broader standoff between Bumpy Johnson and organized crime did eventually shift toward other forms of pressure, things like police harassment and economic squeezing, rather than direct violence. And it's worth noting plainly that the documented reasons for that shift involve wartime federal scrutiny and a mutual desire to avoid outside attention, not folklore about hidden marksmen. Whether the oral tradition's version adds a real piece to that picture or simply reflects community pride wrapped around a real and complicated history, I can't say with certainty, and I don't think anyone honestly can. What happened to the women in this story afterward, according to those who've passed it down, is that most simply returned to their ordinary lives once things settled. The story of Odessa, as it's told, has her continuing to work as a seamstress for years afterward, and if you'd passed her on the street in the following decade, the story goes, you'd never have guessed at any of it. That invisibility, the tradition suggests, was always the real point, letting her fold back into ordinary life once whatever role she played was done, without recognition, without her name in any paper, just a quiet life that continued on much as it had before. I think that's part of why this particular story doesn't appear often in the more widely read histories of Bumpy Johnson and organized crime in Harlem. The figures who get remembered in most written accounts tend to be the ones whose names ended up in police files and newspaper clippings, and that record skews heavily toward men, not necessarily because women weren't involved in the broader life of the neighborhood, but because the kind of quiet, undocumented contribution this story describes rarely leaves the kind of paper trail historians rely on. If women really did play the role this oral tradition assigns them, they may well have wanted it that way, given the obvious risks of any other outcome. I want to close by being honest with you one more time, because I think that honesty is what makes a story like this worth telling at all. Much of what you've heard tonight comes from Harlem oral tradition rather than from official records or historical documentation. Historians broadly agree on the outline of the real conflict between Bumpy Johnson and organized crime in this period. The territorial dispute, the early violent confrontation, and the subsequent shift toward economic and legal pressure. The specific claims in this telling, the names, the individual encounters, the idea of a coordinated group of women serving as Harlem's hidden defenders, these remain part of community memory and local folklore rather than settled historical fact. As with many oral traditions, some parts may preserve genuine historical memories, while others may have grown or changed as the story passed from one generation to the next. I'm not telling you this story because I can prove it happened exactly this way. I'm telling it to you because it's been carried carefully through generations of a community that valued it enough to keep it alive, quietly, for a very long time, and I think stories carried that carefully, for that long, are worth hearing even when we can't fully verify them. That's the story as it was told to me, and now I've told it to you, with all the honesty about its uncertain edges that I think it deserves. Keep it somewhere safe, And keep in mind that some of the most important pieces of a community's history live in memory long before, if ever, they make it onto a page.